I never imagined a simple job modeling for an art class would lead me down a path of fear and obsession. It started with an innocent enough day, until a stranger's fascination with my anatomy sent my life spiraling. Now, every text sends shivers down my spine, and I'm caught in a nightmare I can't escape. This all began a few nights ago. I was sitting motionless in front of the class when the instructor's voice suddenly cut through the sound of pencils on paper. "I've told you before, do not approach the model." I was supposed to stay perfectly still. It was my only job requirement, so I couldn't turn around to see who she was talking to or what was going on behind me. I eventually heard the creak of a chair, so it appeared that whoever she was talking to did sit back down. Halfway through the class, though, the instructor's phone rang, and she hurriedly told us she needed to step outside for a moment. Within seconds of her leaving the room, I saw a shadow cast over my shoulder from someone standing behind me. Whoever it was hovered there for a while before coming so close that I could feel their breath on my neck. I felt incredibly exposed sitting up there alone, especially since I couldn't turn to look at them. I was immensely grateful that we were at least in a room filled with a few other people. I gasped at the feel of something cold on my bare skin, which was followed by a familiar sound. A measuring tape? He leaned in even closer. I had to fight against the instinct to squirm away as he whispered into my ear, "Your bones are exquisite." I heard the rest of the class murmuring around us. It was my first time modeling for this class. The prior models never returned for some reason, and I really needed the extra $75. But they all must have known that they weren't supposed to touch me. Just as he began to say something else, someone unseen came to my rescue and pulled him away from me. When the instructor returned a few minutes later, she kicked him out of the class immediately. I was worried he'd make a scene, but thankfully, he left without a word. It was only after I heard his steps grow distant and a locker open and eventually close down the hall that I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I thought that'd be the end of it, until I was packing up afterwards. I realized he hadn't been emptying his own locker. He'd been going through mine. Everything was in disarray. My clothes were tossed around and one of my shoes was missing. I noticed that my phone had been shoved into a different pocket of my bag, and my wallet was open. Later that same night, the texts began. "You truly inspired me today, Jade." I didn't recognize the phone number, but they clearly knew me. Before I could even respond to ask who they were, they sent another. "You're perfect for my project. Together we're going to create something beautiful." I tried reverse lookup, but all I could find was that it was a virtual number, which was beyond my skill level to track down any further. I was convinced it was the creep from art class, though. I could feel it. I could almost hear those words whispered in his voice, once again right behind me, just out of sight. I turned around instinctively, but of course there was no one there. There was no one in my apartment but me. I decided I'd go to the police the next day, but while I was getting ready for bed, his text continued. The graceful curve of the spine and ribs under flesh contrasted against the sharpness of the shoulders. Incredible. Suddenly, it hit me. It wasn't just that my stuff tossed was around in my locker carelessly. My wallet had been open and clearly been rifled through. What if he'd looked at my driver's license? The new one, with my current address that I'd finally updated after moving a year ago. I suddenly felt very afraid at the thought of sleeping in my own apartment. I tried to keep my voice from trembling while I called my best friend Kate and asked if I could stay with her for the night. Despite it being so late, she instantly agreed. No questions asked. So I hurriedly packed up my bag and headed to her apartment, taking one last look over my shoulder before I closed my car door behind me. My phone pinged again as I was driving, and I read it once I parked. "I look forward to beginning our work together." I showed Kate the texts once when I got to her place. Part of me hoped she'd laugh and tell me I was overreacting, but her face paled as she scrolled through. She told me I could stay with her as long as I needed, and agreed that I should go to the police the next morning. She even volunteered to go with me. At the police station, I showed the guy taking my statement the messages, including the one I'd received overnight. "When are you coming home?" He immediately grabbed another officer, and they both asked me questions. A lot of it was a blur because I hadn't been able to sleep the night before. But I do remember how they shared a look when I told them I'd first encountered the guy in an art class. After we talked to the police. I spent most of the hours of the day while Kate was at work pacing around her apartment. The texts he kept sending did not help my nerves. Don't worry, I've perfected my methods over the years. It won't even be that messy. I was getting stir-crazy by the second day, but since I never even saw his face, I could pass him on the street and never realize it. There is nothing more terrifying than the feeling of being hunted, but not knowing by whom. The police recommended that I didn't block the number, that I kept an eye out for if he sent anything that would reveal where or even who he might be. The process is time-consuming, but the only way to guarantee no damage to the smaller, more delicate pieces. Luckily, I'm a patient man. After reading that, I decided to just walk around Kate's apartment complex to get some fresh air. The walking trails weren't visible from the main road. I just needed to get out, and away from the constant barrage of increasingly unnerving texts. I put my phone on silent, and after I felt a bit calmer, headed back inside. I let out a sigh of relief, and even smiled for a fleeting moment as I locked the door behind me, until I checked my phone. "You look lovely today, Jade. I think we'll get started soon." I followed up with the police again, but they didn't have much news for me other than that the name he'd given to the program when he enrolled in the course was fake. He'd stopped texting for a while, and after almost a full day of blissful silence, I allowed myself a small bit of hope that maybe it would be okay. Maybe he'd given up, moved on. Maybe everything could go back to normal. Until he messaged again last night. "You really do have such beautiful bones. I hope they can find him soon, because I woke up to a new text this morning. I can't wait to hold them in my hands."